Well, hello to you wherever you are in the world. My name is Barry Cullen. I'm the diversity analyst with RICS, and I'm delighted to be able to welcome you to this webinar, which is part of the COP26 series from the World Built Environment Forum and RICS. The webinar today is called Room to Breathe, Creating Equality of Green Spaces in Towns and Cities. And it's certainly one that I'm really excited that we're involved with. It's an area that's of huge both professional and personal interest to me. So just going through some of the housekeeping first of all, I would encourage you, given that we have people joining us from all over the world, to be able to ask as many questions as you can through the chat function on the webinar. So please make sure that you get as many questions into our expert panelists as possible. First of all, I'd like to say a huge thank you to our lead tech partner, A-Site, for sponsoring today's webinar. We're really pleased to be able to put this on in partnership with A-Site. And as I say, my name is Barry Cullen. I'm diversity analyst with RICS. I'm responsible for leading diversity and inclusion within RICS and the profession. And so this particular topic is of huge interest to me. I think with the fact that green spaces are able to provide a welcome oasis to the built-up areas of our towns and cities, and they promote physical health and well-being and help reduce the urban heat island effect. But easy access to good quality green space isn't always equal. So often deprived neighbourhoods suffer disproportionately from limited access. And moreover, the quality of such local spaces is likely to be lower than with more affluent areas. And so we're looking today at how this imbalance can be redressed and how green spaces can be improved for the benefit of everyone. And I'm delighted to welcome our panelists this afternoon. We have Linda Huang, Senior Director, Strategy and Innovation at the Trust for Public Land. Welcome, Linda. We have Mark Newhausen, Research Professor, Director of the Urban Planning, Environment and Health Initiative and Director of Air Pollution and Urban Environment Programme with IS Global. And Georgina Dowling, Director and Head of Impact Assessment at CBRE. So certainly a group of experts who will be able to lead us through this really interesting and insightful webinar today. So let's get into this. And our first question that I would like to put first to Mark is, what impact do you feel that COVID-19 has had on the importance of green space in towns and cities?
Thanks so much, and glad to be here. I think it was very important. I think people discovered green space or rediscovered green space again. I mean, and if I look at my own city, Barcelona, we don't have so much green space, but during the COVID pandemic, particularly, when the lockdown allowed it, all the green spaces were full. I've never seen so many people going around, walking around, cycling, whatever they did, just get out there and enjoy the green space. And partly this may be because, people were more stressed, and we know that going to green spaces actually reduces your stress and helps with restoration. And that may have been one of the main reasons, I think. Also, what we've seen is that city council have become much more aware how important green space actually is for people, and there are more plans now to create more green spaces. And I hope that the COVID pandemic actually will leave a legacy of more creation of green spaces that people actually can use.
Absolutely, and I think certainly my own experience, I'm very fortunate to live opposite some public open space, and I'd never seen it so full during the pandemic, and that's continued. It hasn't just been a one-off as a result of the pandemic actually being in place. It's actually continued. So you've seen more people using and accessing those spaces. So I think that sustainability part of it is really important, and in factoring in planning for the future as well. Thank you, Mark. Linda, can I turn to you and ask, what are the studies revealing about the allocation of green space between well-off and less affluent areas?
Yeah, thank you for that great question. So I will speak to at least the 100 largest cities in the United States. We do an analysis of their park systems where we're looking at acres, amenities, access, investment. And in this 10th year of our Park Score Index ranking, we added park equity metrics. And we discovered that across the 100 largest cities in the United States, residents of neighborhoods where most people identify as Black, Hispanic, Indigenous, and Native American, or Asian American Pacific Islander have access to an average of 44% less park space per person than residents in neighborhoods that are predominantly white. And we saw a similar disparity when we looked at residents in low-income neighborhoods versus residents in high-income neighborhoods. So it's a significant, significant park equity divide that we're working on, and we see that across the board. There's a lot of opportunity for improvement today.
Wow, and when we're looking at the planning of that, really, is it the fact that those areas aren't particularly the planning hasn't been there in the outset, that people are able to access those green spaces, or is there something more to that particular imbalance, really?
Yeah, so what we find is that, at least in the United States, a lot of that, the imbalance in the built environment, in particular in access to green spaces, reflects historic inequities going back to the early 1930s here, when this country put in place policies that we refer to as redlining. So
Right.
investments were directed to neighborhoods that were considered safe, and they tended to be predominantly whiter, wealthier neighborhoods. And so when we look back at these dated redlining maps and we compare the park equity data that we've collected on park space per person, they map almost exactly on top of each other. So we're talking about policies that go back and all the way to, housing covenant policies as well. So they really restricted people to certain neighborhoods, and as well where the investments were made into those places.
So a systemic issue then. Mark,
Absolutely.
Is there anything that you'd like to mention around this?
Yeah, I think the situation is not always the same here in Europe, and it's partly how the cities are built as well. Because typically, like in the US, in the city centers, it's more where the poorer live, and on the outskirts, the richer would have more green. Here in Europe, it's often the other way around. That in the city center, you've got richer people living and poorer people more on the side. So it's in Europe, it's a much more mixed picture of you can get some cities where the poor have less green, but they're also, like in Barcelona, the rich people don't have green because they live right in the city center. They also have higher air pollution levels. But also when we look at, I'm doing quite a lot of studies on green space and health. We know that there is always a very strong correlation in the US between social economic status and green space, and that's not always what we see here in Europe. So when we do the studies, we use slightly different models to account for these differences.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. I think there is that contrast in the way that different parts of the world are configured, really, and different urban spaces are accessed, and who lives in those spaces. And I think the impact on people who live in less affluent areas is one that obviously can't be taken out of this, because if you don't have that access to green spaces, you're obviously missing out on the health and well-being benefits that I think we'll probably touch on as we're going through. Georgina, if I may, can I turn to you and ask, how do you think we can create greater equality of green space across our towns and cities?
I'm coming at this from a UK perspective. That's the environment that I work within, and I work with new developers on developing schemes and projects across the UK. And I think that the critical element to trying to drive greater equality and access of green space is about having more of it in many circumstances. I think that is one of the easiest ways that we can fix this, is just drive the level of provision across the UK. The challenge is finding the land. The challenge is finding sufficient land to make that green space meaningful. And I think the problem that we have in the UK quite often is that a lot of the local policies, and to borrow a phrase from the biodiversity net gain discussion that's going around at the moment, around public open space and public accessible green space, the policies that the UK have is typically around no net loss. So it's about trying to maintain an area ratio per 1,000 head of population, rather than seeking an increase and a gain. Where you don't have these kind of policies around no net loss buried in a local policy plan document or similar, and where you have a site-specific policy allocation that says, actually, we see this as a really critical development site for our city or our town, and we want this to bring forward a 10-hectare open space. Those ones where it hooks into a specific site, and when a developer's coming along to acquire a site, they understand what they're going to lose in terms of developable footprint, and they understand that that's a policy requirement. And it's a brave developer that decides to completely disregard the local plan and not try and develop in conformity with it. They're sort of setting themselves up for hurdles, and they can negotiate that as part of the site acquisition. And they can acknowledge that they're going to have to put a proportion of that site forwards towards green and open space. The challenge around that is making sure that those local plans are in place. It's not an easy set of steps that local authorities have to go through in the UK, and it does take time. But having a really core, strong policy requirement as a driver puts that plan in place, and also allows a collection of sites to come together and think about it slightly more cohesively than individual development that's just according with a kind of overarching no net loss policy. That all being said, I think we are going to have an interesting challenge on our hands. We've just had the Environment Bill in the UK, which has received a royal assent today, and that is requiring a 10% increase in biodiversity net gain for new developments. And whilst I think that on the one hand that will be great, we'll see some more green space coming forward as part of that policy, it's inevitably going to lead to a little bit of a conflict around space that's required for biodiversity enhancement versus space that's publicly accessible, and where you can go and play football on the site, or you can have some play space involved as part of that. So it's an interesting challenge that we're looking forward to in the next couple of years, I think.
Absolutely, yeah, and one that's prompted a question from Thomas, who's on the webinar today. So I'll throw this one in for the three of you to be able to give some response to, because I think it ties in perfectly with what you've just said, Georgina. And it's, how do we balance the priorities of creating green space and building much needed new affordable housing, particularly in smaller and higher density cities?
It's a real challenge. It's a real challenge. And I go back to my comment earlier about having things enshrined in the local plan, because, as much as we come at developers about not providing enough of everything, at some point there has to be a balancing equation around the finances, and that starts at the point of site acquisition. So if you understand that there's a requirement for open space on a site alongside a policy requirement for affordable housing, you know at which point you need to be purchasing and pitching that price point for the acquisition, and therefore you've got a better handle on how you're going to deliver all of those things. I think what happens too often in the mix is that the open space is forgotten at the start. It's not priced into or thought about in terms of the loss of developable footprint on a site. It becomes an afterthought in terms of design, and affordable housing is always front and centre and remains the primary area of contribution that a developer will look at. If we switch that, if we make open space come up much sooner in that thought process and be priced accordingly, it's so much easier to deliver, particularly if there's a really strong policy process forcing and driving that through.
Yeah, and it shouldn't be one or the other, should it? So, Mark, sorry.
Yeah, I'm not completely familiar with the planning situation in the UK, but of course, what we're looking for is denser housing in that way. I mean, that we need to think about apartment living like what we have here in Barcelona. where you have apartment living up to 4 or 5 high, I think, not higher. I don't advocate skyscrapers, but get away from the more, I would always say American, but also in the UK, where you got this single housing with a garden, blah blah blah, because that takes up a lot of space and you can't house so many people. So I think you're looking at denser housing that allows social housing as well, where you get 4 or 5 high. And then also for the green space, we're thinking about as a larger space, but I think green can also be not so big in a way. What we know what gives health benefits, and this is simply having trees in the streets, for example. I mean, that helps quite a bit. We can also think about green walls, green roofs. Now, the green roofs don't help always for health, but the green walls do. And just building in green wherever we can, actually, we know that gives also health benefits. I mean, it doesn't necessarily need to be a big park or even a smaller park, I mean, what you have. So I think there are many ways around this to do this. Often developers, when I look at when they do some developments, when they make these nice pictures, there's always some green in there, but then actually when they build it, the green has disappeared. I don't know what's happened to that, but that's typically what I see to make it more attractive. They put in the drawings beautiful trees, green, and everything looks very green, and then the final product, everything has disappeared. And it's what you think, what is going on here? I mean, and I think city councils need to enforce more that they bring in green space wherever they can, whatever little space they have. And we have to realize that we have a lot of public space generally for cars. I mean, there's a lot of asphalt around for cars that actually can be turned into much better user space by putting in green and reduce car use and public and active transportation.
Yeah, one of the things that one of the trends that we've noticed here in the United States, around at least the 100 largest cities, is the use of schoolyards. So many schools, their playgrounds are asphalt, and so we launched an initiative a couple of years back where we are converting those asphalt park playgrounds into kid-designed, climate-smart parks. And so they're when you put in a joint use agreement with that school district and the park agency in the city, basically after school hours, those can become public parks, public access parks. So it's a really nice way where you're not having to fight for, where Georgina mentioned the no net loss policy. We're not fighting for every last bit of space out there, where you're forcing this conversation around kind of a zero-sum game around, well, do we have development or do we have green space? We're saying, look, we have solutions right in front of us. We're looking at vacant lots. We're looking at kind of rails to trails as well. So I think to Mark's point, there is a lot of opportunity. You can get really creative around looking for spaces to be greened. And sometimes they're right in front of you.
I think there's also a challenge in the UK that where you're bringing forward development, and there is, there are design requirements around amenity space for residents, that there are requirements if you're bringing forward a residential population for play space and open space. But if you're building on a particularly dense site, some of that provision will quite often go in as roof gardens, or it will go in as kind of privately accessible courtyards. And I think this comes back to that question about equality of access and making sure that where these developments are coming forward, that it's not just a case of kind of serving the need of the residents of that particular scheme, but really good urban design is about connecting into local communities and making sure that you have got a space that people have a sense of permissiveness to go into. That there's a lot of the phrase privately owned public space, POPs, in the UK, and how they've been managed. And I think that's another question when it comes to green space, particularly as it becomes of more value to people over things like COVID, where we suddenly were far more concerned about the quality of where we took our daily exercise element, as opposed to we're constantly passing through the outdoor environment, and so we sort of feel like we've got our 1,000 steps in because we've walked through a street. If you've only got one opportunity a day, you want to do it in a lovely park, you want to do it in a nice green area. So I think we've learned to value that more, making sure the nicest areas are still truly publicly accessible, I think is a real challenge when it comes to urban design.
Absolutely. And I think that really leads into the next question, really, around that health impact, because as you mentioned, you know, if you look at how people were gaining their hours exercise in the UK and however it was accommodated in other parts of the world, just walking up and down a street isn't necessarily going to be what you want to do with that precious time. And then if you're living in a space where there is that lack of green space, or living in an area where there is a lack of green space, that's bound to have an obvious health impact. So Mark, what is research telling us about that?
I mean, what we know now, that there's quite a lot beneficial impacts on health from green space. We know that it reduces premature mortality. We just finished a study where we looked at 1,000 cities in Europe, and we estimated if we would green the cities up to the WHO standards, we could prevent 40,000 premature deaths each year. That's a very large number. That's a very large impact. We know that having green space also prevents cardiovascular disease. We also know that children, that have more green space, have a better cognitive development, have better exam results. We did a large study here in Barcelona where we looked at kids going to a green school or not so green school, and we saw a 5-6% difference in the development of the brain of the kids. But also on the other side of the age spectrum, we see that we could prevent Alzheimer with more green space. We see lower rates of Alzheimer, for example, and other forms of dementia in greener areas. We also see that pregnant mothers giving birth actually have babies with a higher birth weight, was in a way better as well. So we see many different health benefits from having green space around where people live, or how they commute, or where they work. One of the nicest studies that we recently did is also we looked at the mental health of people commuting, and we found that active commuters through green space had the best mental health, better than if they were actively commuting through gray space, or if they were sitting in the car for gray space. So this kind of also commuting through green space has extra benefits. And we know that people are looking for green space when they do something, when they want to be active, or if they want to, say, cycle to work, they go for greener routes because they're normally nicer. And that gives a great experience to people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose there's a link there as well, I would suggest, around the cost benefit of this on health services. And, has there been any research that's been carried out that demonstrates that actually having access to greener space has a positive impact on the cost of health services and the provision of health services? That's something that's come out of any research that the three of you have come across?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there are various studies that actually show that there are great benefits to our hospital system.
Yep.
The one problem that we have in that way when it comes to cost benefit is that people that are paying for green space to put in green space are not the same ones that are benefit from it. And that makes it a bit more difficult. But yes, there are many studies that show that we can save millions in healthcare costs if we would have more green space.
Yeah, we part of my team, I have a couple of conservation economists who work as part of our team here, and we have done about 30 or so studies across the United States where we're looking very specifically at the economic benefits that park systems contribute to the city or that region where the park system is located. And we find one of the categories of benefits we look at is healthcare cost savings. And so we find time and time again millions of dollars in healthcare cost savings, because we know that a lot of research that we've seen, similar to the work that Mark is doing, is that when people live in proximity to parks, their physical activity levels go up. We all witnessed it during the pandemic. Here in the United States, people were flocking to their parks, and there was just enormous use, right? And we continue to see that today. But when that use, it means that there's more physical activity, and that translates into all these different markers for health. And so it definitely translates into cost savings.
Yeah.
I must say, I forgot to mention one of the main health benefits is better mental health. We see, many people suffer of mental health problems, and some of the biggest savings actually come from having better mental health and reducing sleep deprivation, use of antidepressants, etc. And that's got a very large impact.
That's something that we've seen in hospital design, for example, is the use and necessity of green roofs. If you're in a hospital that's kind of got height to it, green walls and garden spaces around, so that people get that sense of reprieve, because you're bedbound in some instances, and it's what you can see out of your window that counts.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, just factoring that in, and often it isn't just the actual, the experience can be experienced in different ways, can't it? So it's, it's being able to recognise that direct health benefit that can be experienced from just seeing greenery, as well as being able to walk and be amongst it. So yeah, that's fascinating, the ways that we can kind of cultivate that it's a cultural shift, really, and a recognition of the importance of having nature in everything that we do, really, isn't it? So Linda, I'd like to come to you around if we want to lessen the urban heat island effect, how important are green spaces in this?
Yeah, remarkably important. So here in the United States, heat is the #1 weather-related killer. And so anytime we can use green space to address that, it's a significant win. There are a lot of things that can happen, from short-term to medium to long-term adaptations. So in the short term, we're seeing the use of more cooling centers. City of Paris did a really fantastic study looking at the effect of cooling centers and kind of, what happens to mitigate heat. More medium-term solutions is maybe obvious, is planting trees in the right places, the right species, having maintenance over those trees as well over time. And then longer term, it's thinking about smart surfaces. So every surface that can be converted, asphalt that can be converted to something more permeable, rooftops, not just in parks, but along medians, walkways, sidewalks, everywhere. So we've done some analysis for a handful of cities where we are looking at every single space in the city that could be plantable, whether for green infrastructure, for food, and for cooling. So there's so much that people can do, and I think it's increasingly we're seeing cities get a lot more sophisticated in thinking about kind of the range of things that they can do along those, from the short term all the way out to the long term. Thankfully, there's a lot more data coming out. I mean, I think this country does not have the great kind of the healthcare systems that we see in places like the UK, where all of your health related data is in one place and it is accessible. You can look at it along with a lot of other really good spatial data, like the prevalence and the size of parks. So in this country, it's really hard for us to know. We have maybe one county in the United States that offers information on emergency room visits that are related to heat. So we can get some of that information around asthma, so linking to poor air quality. But it's tough then for governments to kind of, understand where where the hot spots are, where the urban heat islands are, and then try to think about where they have opportunities with current parks, and then all of these other spaces that could be converted.
I think you're absolutely right, Linda. One of the benefits that we have in the UK is the plethora of data that we have. And it leads to some really good joined up thinking. So we have all of that health data. Our local authorities are kind of responsible for the management of our local areas. And they have a remit to produce a document on a regular basis called a joint strategic needs assessment, which looks at both what the health needs are and what the local authority needs are. And I can increasingly see things like the effects of heat coming through as a consequence of climate change, because even in the UK, we're starting to have that effect and experience those aspects, and it's really leading us to question how we tackle things like that, because we do see an uptick in hospital admissions around those periods. It is part of the national risk register that the government maintains. So but we're in a very fortunate position that we have the data to then look into those things, and we have the policy mechanisms to join up and think about how to tackle it. I can't imagine how it operates in the US, where you're lacking that sort of facility and mechanism.
Yeah, it doesn't well.
I think what we saw before as well is that many city councils just loved to asphalt whatever space they had, because it was nice, cheap, and it would stay for a long time. And you see now there's a culture shift, partly because of climate change, but also other reasons, to actually try to get rid of some of the asphalt and put more green there. Of course, this comes with extra cost, and that sometimes stops councils, I think, putting in green space, because, to maintain it, well, first to planting green is not so easy, and then to maintain it is, of course, more costly than putting in asphalt, but it's got great benefits.
I think what's really interesting as well is that we're really seeing the agenda change in the private sector as well, so the onus isn't solely on councils. So it's all of this is obviously very timely with COP26 at the moment, but with investment funds and real estate owners having ESG agendas and strategies, they are looking at their assets and saying, well, what can we do? How can we improve our GRESB score? What can we do to improve our biodiversity? And they're considering the actions that they can take on existing real estate, and some of that is rewilding and wildflower planting on grass verges that they can normally be paying for very regular maintenance and mowing, but actually that they can increase the biodiversity aspect of it, or looking at their flood risk and thinking about how they can improve the attenuation on that site by removing some of that tarmac and putting green space in. And when it comes to urban heat island, that collective kind of review that's happening as a consequence of these investment in ESG drivers is starting to trickle down, and I think we will only see it increase at an exponential rate over the next sort of 5 years.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, I think that is these conversations are timely, and I think there is that greater need for government awareness, for decision making locally, for a broader strategic plan as to where do you build, how do you ensure that you're accessing the space sufficiently to ensure that there are things that are going to create greater biodiversity, that are providing some form of flood defence as well in increasing areas of development. So it's absolutely critical that these are given considerations. And I think, that leads into the next question I have for you, Georgina, is that, as we build more and there is a constant demand for land, how at risk are our green spaces?
I think it depends where we're looking at building and what the green space typology is. If it's playing pitches or playing fields, for example, in the UK, they are, there is quite a level of stringent protection afforded them. So the public body Sport England is required to be consulted on any potential loss of a playing pitch or a playing field, even if it's not been in operation for the last 5 years. They strongly resist the loss of that space, and they are able to make a recommendation, for example, if their objection is not addressed prior to the application going in, that it gets referred to the Secretary of State for potential call-in, which no developer really wants to go near. So, when it comes to sort of playing pitches and that aspect of it, you will always see replacement on either a like-for-like or in consultation with the local authority about what their requirement is, a more appropriate arrangement of playing pitches and sports facilities or playing fields. I think it depends on the kind of the informal green spaces and publicly accessible open spaces that haven't really had the same level of management or consideration given to them, that are kind of ad hoc, aren't particularly formalized, but people use to walk their dog, or they like to go for a run on because they know they can get their 10 minutes in as part of their couch to 5K or whatever it is. It's these informal bits that matter to that local population but haven't got a formal designation on them that are at risk particularly. And I think it's for those aspects, it's really about councils understanding what their public space is and what these informal components comprise, And there are mechanisms in UK policy for local communities to come together and designate them of local community value, and start to put in some sort of safeguards themselves. It's not easy, I'm not going to lie. It's always a challenge, and I think it's far more of a challenge, aligning with kind of Mark's experience of this, tends to be edge of cities and suburban areas where, you know, developers are particularly looking for a really good development footprint, and that will, you know, comprise some existing buildings but some green space where they can look to bring forward a cohesive development. And in those circumstances, I go back to that policy question about how local authorities organise themselves. There are a lot of checks and balances in the UK. It's just about making sure that they are strongly in place and that they are followed through as they are supposed to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, that provision and development, and this is a question that's come from the audience, from Anoush. You'd mentioned earlier about the pseudo public space, or sometimes called privately owned public space, or POPs. And I guess that would be factored into that demand for land, really, and being able to secure parts of a development for the access of those particular residents. You know, what's the view from all of you around how that is being factored? Does that well, not even inadvertently, does that set out that creates an inequality right from the off? And is that something that could actually be used if there were an affordable housing development, that there was a privately owned space that was then dedicated to those residents? What are the thoughts from all of you around how that's positioned and provisioned within developments?
From my perspective of POPs, I think we have to be really careful around them. I don't think we're going to get away from them, because I think local authorities will quite often embrace the idea that they're not going to be responsible for the management and maintenance of upkeep of a space. But I think how and the conditions of use that are put around them by a local authority as part of the planning agreement, that make sure they remain publicly accessible and people have a sense of ability to access them, are critical. Because, you know, equality of public space is also about feeling like you have a right to be there. And if a space is being policed by a non-public body with no kind of restriction on how assiduously they're pursuing that role, you will have problems with people accessing that space. You will have a sense that they don't feel like they can go in there. And that, you know, that really is about not creating silos of particularly high levels of socioeconomic, you know, developments effectively. It's a challenge. It is a challenge, and it does come back to how that's designed from the get-go, the level of community engagement that occurs, and how strongly the local authority talks about and seeks to manage that space. And I think it is more successful when it comes back into the local authority's ownership, but with a sort of pot of money there to support it on an ongoing basis, rather than it staying in private ownership.
Yeah, I agree.
Linda, sorry, Mark.
Yeah, I think public accessibility is very important. I mean, otherwise, it becomes difficult. I like this. I don't know if you know this rule of thumb that recently was promoted, this 330-300 rule, where for new developments, what you should be able to see free trees from your window. You should have 30% green space within your neighborhood, and there should be a green space of at least 0.5 hectares within 300 meters of the house, as kind of a rule of thumb. And I think it makes sense. I mean, some of it, you know, with research we've already backed up that they all provide benefits. And I like this rule. I mean, it's coming from Cecil Konijnenberg, who is an urban forester, but I think it makes sense.
And where's that being implemented? Sorry.
Well, he's at the moment promoting it. It's trying to be, I'm not sure if any council is implementing it, but you will see it. Actually, yesterday I published a little article in The Conversation in the UK where I described some of this as well, and also referred to his article where he promotes it as well. at the moment, he's got a lot of interest in different cities around the world that trying to implement this particular rule. Of course, it's not always so easy, particularly the 30% land use to green space is quite demanding in a way, but I think having like a few trees from your window is quite nice as well. And we know there are benefits of having green space, a green space view from your window. I mean, we've seen it now in a number of different studies.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I cut into someone comment. So, Jeannie, were you coming back on that
no,
comment?
I was just commenting. It's a really cool idea. I hadn't heard or come across about it yet, and we, you know, there was CABE, the Design Council. I'm harking back about 10 years ago now. Produced a document on an open space hierarchy in the UK, which sort of said actually this is people's willingness to travel to get to different sizes and scales of spaces, and I think that's framed a lot of the kind of thoughts about where we can build and how much we need to build dependent on the accessibility to greater spaces. But I think intrinsically in that, there's always a level of inequality because it makes an assumption that someone can afford to travel to a larger open space. So the concept of having that 330, 300, I think it was, it really intrigues me. And I think it'd be a really good rule of thumb to look at in the UK.
Definitely. And Linda, I mean, in the US, it'd be interesting to see what the concept is around that, but I'm also linking it to a question I'd like to pose to you around what are the challenges in providing and maintaining good quality green space for everyone, and how can those challenges be overcome? So it is, you know, are POPs something that are common in the US, and you know, and if that's there, then you know, is that a bad thing, or is that something that needs to be factored into development? And how can we ensure that, you know, we can provide and then maintain good quality green space for everyone?
Yeah, we at the Trust for Public Land, one metric that we think about for cities is the 10-minute walk. So and that's what we track as one of the many metrics that we track is how many people live within a 10-minute walk of a quality park, and what do we know about the people, and what do we know about people who are outside of that 10-minute walk shed of a park. And there are a couple of different challenges that we're trying to address head on. One is just understanding the magnitude of the challenge in front of you. So how many people can walk to a quality park and how many cannot? So one of the tools, we have one of the largest databases for parks for the United States. So we know where every park is for 14,000 cities and towns. So you can go to tpl.org/parkserve, type in your city, and you see immediately where the parks are. It'll give you statistics on how many people have access, 10-minute walk access, and how many do not. And then we provide, you know, demographic information as well around race and ethnicity, income. And then we're thinking a lot about equity as well. So we include things like age, access to a vehicle, education levels of linguistic isolation as well. So one, the challenge is just, do you understand how many people do have access and who do not? And secondly, it's about funding, fortunately or unfortunately. And we're also very interested in this idea of the spatial distribution of funding. So which neighborhoods are actually receiving funding from their park agencies? And what we saw last year, at least, or just in this year's release of our Park Score Index, was that out of the 100 largest cities, nearly 2/3 of our city park and recreation budgets reported facing a budget cut, either in their last fiscal year or they were anticipating one in this current fiscal year. And so those budget cuts were anywhere from 10% all the way up to 30%. So what we're seeing is, you know, a decade of underinvestment in city parks, and it's left them with this enormous backlog of deferred maintenance. So among all the cities that were reporting data back to us, that backlog of maintenance totaled about $12 billion. And so the scary part about that number here in this country is that, you know, we have a National Park Service, and so there's national parks all across the country. And the National Park Service looked at their backlog of deferred maintenance, and it is also about $12 billion. So the funding is pretty critical. And it just, park agencies are trying to find good staffing as people are flocking to their parks and they're not finding the funding available always. So that's certainly one of them. And then two is just around, I think Georgia spoke to this really well, around engagement. So talking to people about what they're interested in their parks, letting them daydream a little bit and co-design. We facilitate a lot of park building at the Trust for Public Land. So it's about asking people what they're interested in, but doing that in an authentic way where you're actually giving them the opportunity to design that space and just, with their neighbors. It's a powerful mechanism, not just for addressing access to good quality parks, but because we think about community at the center of everything we do, and I think our mission is land for people. So for us, we're building parks because of all the health benefits, the climate benefits, the equity benefits, but we're thinking about that community as well. And so we know when you take people through the process of designing a park together, something really powerful happens. You begin to shift power, you give them agency. And so I think a lot of the challenges for city agencies is trying to think through all of those things. How do I put more people within a 10-minute walk of a park? How do I find the resources to do that? And then how do I ensure that what I'm building is actually what people are asking for, and then something that they will use and feel like, as Georgina says, that it's a place where they belong.
Yeah, and have ownership of.
Sorry, go on, Barry.
No. I was just saying about ownership of that. But yeah, Georgina, please come in.
All I was going to say was I think that particularly in the UK around urban parks, there's this perception around teenagers, for example, that we don't want to see them clustering in groups, and it's like they're a member of society. They have to go somewhere, they have to enjoy the park as well, and if you design in cohesion with groups and you really think about giving them a space, not only do you give them somewhere to go and talk and a sense of permission about using that space, but parks are great melting pots. They let us see who our community is and understand that, it's a proper mix of society. And I think that you only achieve that, and you only achieve that kind of understanding of equality if you truly have that mix able to access and feel like they can use a space. And I think there's also an ongoing issue, which I think there's never an easy solution to this, but about the safety aspect of parks, which I think really precludes a lot of society, and particularly at the moment in the UK, we've just hit daylight saving time. So we're having very dark evenings, which means that you really have to think about when you want to use your public open spaces, and whether they are open in the hours that you're not working, and whether you feel able to go and use them as potentially a single woman. So I think those aspects are other considerations that are their challenges around how we use our public open space. Then they're not easy solutions to them, but they are things that we should be thinking about, because by not thinking about them, we're automatically discarding components of society.
Completely, and that segues into a question that we've had from the audience, from Lee, who absolutely echoes the comment that you've just made, Georgina, around not all green space is created equal. Many parks are dangerous because they're poorly lit with lots of antisocial behaviour, and how do we ensure quality as well as supply? And I guess that links to what you were saying, Linda, about if you've seen huge cuts to parks and urban green spaces, then obviously that has a negative impact in the way that people experience them. When actually, if you're able to bring people into the design and what people are looking for in those spaces, and create that ownership and agency, then people will value those spaces much more. So, I mean, is there a solution to making sure that green space is created equally, or is it that those local initiatives have to be implemented to ensure that people feel that they have ownership of that?
Yes and yes. I think we're just now beginning to look at what we can measure related to this idea of park quality, because it can be so many things. So we are looking at the existence of specific amenities and the quality of those amenities. We're looking at the funding aspect of it and this idea of the sense of belonging. But at the end of the day, if you what I consider to be a great park experience is going to be really different from what Mark thinks and what Georgina feels as well. And we want to be mindful of all of that. So for us, the quality park, we can start with some things that we can measure around use and resources and this, the non-spatial data, like a sense of belonging, perceptions of safety as well. But at the end of the day, if you're not talking to people who are going to be actively using the park, it doesn't matter how I define park quality for this city here, or what Georgina or Mark thinks is going to be great for a place. If the neighborhood there isn't involved in deciding it, then you have space that you're missing a huge opportunity to bring people together, to address heat, to address health. So the great thing is that we're seeing so many things that cities are doing now to kind of shift decision making. Even some cities in really interesting examples of capital allocation exercises where they draw ideas directly from the communities on where investments should be made in park systems, rather than a park agency coming through and saying, well, we've done this and we've kind of looked across the board, we've identified all of our parks, we gave everybody a grade and a ranking, and so we have a sense for which ones need to be retrofitted or improved in some way. And so you have that kind of top-down approach versus a bottom-up approach where, yes, people actually fill out applications and then they take those into considerations, and those are the ones that they run with. It's remarkable.
Yeah.
I think just comment a bit on it. Sometimes I think it's also a bit different how we interpret what is a park in the US and in Europe, because I know, like, what you call sometimes a park is a whole sports area with lots of activities in there, and that's for us not in a way a park. I mean, a park I think is more often where you have some trees and a path for going through it, and if you're lucky there may be a toilet and perhaps a children's playground. So the kind of concept of park is quite different, I find, at times when I look at the studies, what I've seen so far. I mean, I'm more familiar, to be honest, with parks in the UK because I visit many lovely parks, but they feel differently to some of the US parks that I've been to as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. The definition is different from city to city, region to region, country to country. Absolutely.
Yeah. Here, what they call a park is where you have asphalt with 4 trees. I mean, that's kind of Mediterranean park.
That's a good quality urban space, that.
That's high quality.
Yeah. One comment you made before is about your 10-minute walk, and I think that is equivalent to having a park within 300 meters of the residence. That's what the World Health Organization is promoting. A lot of people think that the World Health Organization is promoting a given number of square meters per inhabitant. Actually, that's an urban myth, and I don't know, but it keeps coming up. But what the WHO is really recommending is to having a park of 0.5 hectares within 300 meters of the house. And I think that's equivalent to the 10 minutes walk.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was just going to mention as well, in terms of community engagement, I worked on a project where the developer took a really enlightened view to community engagement, and they actually, rather than hosting engagement sessions where they expected people to come, and they typically spread them over evenings and at weekends to get people at different points, they actually sent people out to monitor the space over a 24-hour period to really understand how people use that. And I think that's the thing, parks have got a temporal quality to them as well. People use them at different types of the day in different ways, and really understanding that and understanding how you can maximize that use across a day really activates the space and makes it safer for everyone, but it gives you better use out of it. And I think that's a component that often gets forgotten when we're designing these spaces. We don't think about them as kind of having a 24-hour life cycle.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good point. Yeah, they're not excessive.
One thing, because we're talking a lot about parks, but I think we have to realize that green space in streets is quite important as well. And I think we're seeing some really nice stuff going on here in Barcelona. This is the so-called superblock development. In Barcelona, we have a grid system very much car dominated. and now they're trying to pacify the streets and put in more green space. So there's 3 times more green space coming into different neighborhoods just by taking away space from cars, giving it to active transportation. And, you know, this is models that can be followed by other cities as well, I think, where there is sufficient density, because I particularly work where there is a lot of density. The other thing is we talk about a lot of green, but also blue space is good, I think, and we shouldn't forget that, that there are many benefits, and many cities are opening access to waterways, to the blue space, and I think that has many benefits as well. And in some countries, blue and green goes together, sometimes they're separated, but I think that's another way one to think about as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And whilst we're on that, and we're coming to the end now, but I'm going to put you on the spot, Mark, and certainly Linda and Georgina, I'd like you to chip in as well. Which are the best and worst cities for green space, and why? That's not a difficult question, is it?
Well, depends which data you believe. I mean, it's the thing is also how do you measure it and what you're looking for. It's what I said. We recently did this study where we looked at 1,000 cities in Europe for the greenest and cities and the less green cities and the highest mortality related to the lack of green space or not. And the top one that came out for the least green space was Trieste in Italy. And that was in a way funny because people thought there was a lot of green space in Trieste. And true, there is a lot of green space. The problem is all the green space is on the outskirts, on the outside of the city. And actually the city is quite dense and it's very, you know, there's no space for green space. So we followed the rule that green space should be within 300 meters of people's residences. And in that way, there wasn't any green space. Also, Trieste is on the sea, so we didn't account for blue space in our study, and so that's why the rating went down as well. I mean, we didn't put in blue space, but that's what I said, blue space is also good for you. If you look at the bigger cities, we found that Brussels, the capital city, Brussels, had the least green space. Again, a dense city with green space around it, but not very little in the center. Better cities were more in the north.
Okay. Well.
Yeah, we in the United States, anyways, we released the Park Score Index, which I've spoken to. So we're ranking, entire park systems for cities. So we're looking at 5 categories. It's acreage, access, amenities, investment, and now park equity. And at the top of our ranking this year was Washington, D.C., and it was lifted mostly because it has great equitable access in terms of who has access and then how much green space they have access to. So I think it's because it's our capital city, there are many large, beautiful, really well-maintained green spaces. But then if we're looking at just green space by itself, I was just looking at the distribution parkland stats per city. So at the top of our list is actually, oh, I just lost it. Sorry, I'm gonna rank this for you right now. It's the largest. It's actually Anchorage, Alaska, followed by Chesapeake, Virginia. It just so happens that they have, in terms of the number of parks per capita in the city. So, but again, it's hard for us to think about just the amount of green space, because we've just been talking about this panel, it's so much about the quality of the space itself and the experience for people when they get to the space and what else it can deliver for people. So it's one way to think about it, but at the end of the day, we're trying to really help people understand that parks are a fundamental part of our public health infrastructure. So they are not just these nice to have, it is a basic amenity that everybody should have access to. And that's where, you know, the quality part of it is really important.
Absolutely.
I have to say I'm probably biased. I think London's got fantastic green space. I mean, it's got those big formal park spaces, you know, they include playing pitches. It's got so many informal ad hoc spaces, and it's got a great public transport system, so you can get to them really easily. And then you can look at something like Richmond Park, which is not that far from the centre, and it's a huge rural space in a incredibly urban city. You can, there is a green chain walk. You can walk around the edge of London and pretty much do it hopping from park to park, which I think is a testament to kind of accessibility. There's even a movement at the moment to try and get London designated as a national park, because it's just got so much green space across it. And I think, for a city that is so dense in terms of its urban nature, it does very well.
Incredibly, yeah, and lots of blue space as well.
Absolutely.
We've come, I'm afraid, to the end of what has been a really, really stimulating and really insightful conversation. I want to thank the three of you for just giving just a fantastic contribution to this. I knew how interesting this conversation would be, and it certainly hasn't disappointed. So thank you all, Mark, Georgina, and Linda, for your contributions today. It's been excellent. Just a flag up our future webinars, which should appear on screen. I have to say that you haven't been able to see me. I had to come in a different route, so I haven't been able to see our panelists this afternoon. So that's probably contributed to me running slightly over time. So apologies for that, but hopefully you'll be able to see our future webinars up on the screen at present. And then just a final thank you to our sponsors, A-Site, for contributing to this and for helping to make this a really interesting, engaging, informative and inspiring session at whatever time of the day that you're experiencing this. Thanks finally to our panelists, and thank you for joining us, and thanks for your contributions through questions.